The ballroom glittered with light. Crystal chandeliers poured radiance across polished floors, where white gowns swept in arcs and black suits moved with steady grace. The sound of laughter rose above the violins, blending with clinking glasses until the entire hall felt like a single living pulse. Couples spun across the center of the room, their smiles reflected in every shard of crystal and every flash of camera light. But at one corner table, untouched by the swirl of joy, sat a man who did not belong to the rhythm. Ethan Blackwood. His name had once drawn fear and respect in both European and American finance circles. The youngest CEO ever to claim a billion-dollar seat at the head of Blackwood Capital, the man who signed contracts that moved markets. Tonight, though, the tuxedo across his broad shoulders could not hide what he had lost. Beneath the linen-draped table, the chrome of his wheelchair caught the ballroom lights, the symbol of all that had collapsed in an instant. A car accident 2 years ago, a spine damaged beyond repair, the steady strength of his legs taken forever. At first came the doctors with their endless therapies. Then came the fiancé who kissed his cheek once, whispered, "I can't live this kind of life," and left before the tears on her face had even dried. Friends followed her path soon after, and business partners grew polite but distant. So now Ethan sat alone at a wedding where every other table overflowed with cheer. He held a glass of champagne, but it remained untouched, as though even the bubbles mocking him at the surface were too much to bear. His gray-blue eyes swept the room, not with joy, but with the quiet detachment of a man staring at a world that had continued without him. The music shifted to a tender waltz. Couples drifted to the floor again, young, old, even the bride's uncle guiding his wife by the hand with devotion. The room swayed with happiness while Ethan leaned back, his gaze half closed. For him, this wasn't a celebration. It was a reminder of what it felt like to be left behind. A laugh pierced the air, different from the polished chuckles of the elite, brighter, unscripted. Ethan's eyes opened slowly, scanning the crowd for its source. And then he saw her, a woman at the farthest table, dressed simply, trying to calm a young boy who had placed a napkin on his head like a crown. The child's giggle carried across the room, bold and unashamed. Something about it loosened the heaviness around Ethan's chest. For the first time that night, the loneliness bent, even if just a fraction. He didn't yet know why his gaze lingered so long, but that laugh, that spark of life in a room that felt suffocating, pulled him in. And then the boy pointed directly at him, his small voice carried above the orchestra. "Mommy, look, that man has the coolest chair ever." The entire ballroom turned to see. Ethan froze. For years those words would have cut like knives. Tonight they felt different, because the boy's eyes weren't filled with pity. They shone with admiration. If you're already feeling the pull of this story, don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you never miss a new story. And tell us in the comments what country you're watching from. We love to see how far our family stretches around the world. At the far edge of the glittering ballroom, near the double doors where servers slipped in and out with trays of champagne, a small round table sat apart from the rest. It was the table no one truly noticed, the one you gave to distant acquaintances, or those who didn't quite fit into the inner circle of the event. That's where Sophie Miller found herself. She smoothed the skirt of her simple blue dress and let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The dress wasn't new. She'd worn it twice before, once to a friend's engagement party and another time to a parent-teacher meeting. But tonight, under chandeliers and alongside sequins and silk, it felt almost invisible. Sophie didn't come here to be dazzling. She came here because of a single invitation tucked into her mailbox weeks ago. Emily, the bride, had once been her college classmate. They had shared lecture notes, late-night coffee runs, and a few chapters of battered novels. But life had pulled them in opposite directions. Emily soared into a career and an engagement to a man with connections. Sophie, meanwhile, carried the weight of motherhood on her own after Leo's father disappeared before the baby had even taken his first steps. Now, years later, she was at Emily's wedding out of courtesy, seated at a table that reminded her she didn't really belong in this room of polished perfection. "Mommy," Leo whispered, tugging at her hand as his legs swung under the chair. His green eyes widened as he gazed around the hall. "This place looks like a fairy tale movie. Did you see that piano? It's huge, like the one in Santa's house." Sophie laughed, the sound bubbling out despite her nerves. Santa doesn't live in a ballroom, sweetheart. Leo leaned close, lowering his voice as if he were sharing a secret. I think I could be a superhero tonight. I'll protect the bride from the bad guys. What bad guys? Sophie raised an eyebrow, playing along. The ones who don't let her eat the wedding cake, Leo answered with grave seriousness. He tugged a napkin, tying it around his neck like a cape. Don't worry, Mommy, I'll save the day. Sophie pressed her lips together, stifling a laugh before it turned into a full giggle. She knew other guests would glance sideways if she laughed too loudly at the last table. But she couldn't help herself. This was the kind of light Leo brought into every room, even into their tiny apartment with peeling wallpaper and overdue rent notices taped discreetly behind the fridge. The contrast between the ballroom and their everyday life couldn't have been sharper. At home, Sophie juggled late shifts at a cafe, came home smelling of coffee and fried food, and still managed to read Leo his favorite bedtime story before collapsing into bed herself. She lived on stretched-thin paychecks, skipping new shoes and meals out to make sure Leo never went without. And still, she found reasons to laugh, because if she didn't laugh, the weight of it all might crush her. She glanced around the hall again, catching sight of the tables near the stage, glittering with pearls, diamonds, and polite conversations about stock markets and vacation homes. Her table by the door was a silent reminder of where she stood in the hierarchy of life. Leo, oblivious to the unspoken rules of class and status, kept drumming his spoon against the table. Mommy, do you think the bride needs me to guard her cake now? Sophie shook her head, amused. Not yet, superhero. Sit tight, there's still a whole evening ahead. But her own chest tightened with a pang of loneliness. She didn't mind being overlooked, she was used to it, but something about sitting on the edge of a room filled with glittering joy stung more sharply tonight. It was like watching the warmth of a fire from outside the window, close enough to see it, too far to feel it. Then Leo gasped suddenly, dropping his spoon with a clatter. He pointed toward the VIP section in the center of the room. Mommy, look, that chair is so cool. Sophie followed his gaze, and for the first time, she noticed the man seated alone under the golden light. A tuxedo fit perfectly across his frame, his posture regal despite the chrome wheelchair beneath him. His face was striking but distant, eyes gray as a storm-heavy sky. Sophie's heart skipped. She couldn't explain why, but something about his stillness mirrored her own. He looked like a man who, despite the crowd around him, lived apart from it. Mommy, Leo whispered again, tugging her sleeve, why isn't anyone sitting with him? Sophie hesitated, her throat dry. Maybe they're uncomfortable. Uncomfortable about what? Leo tilted his head. His voice was filled with innocence, no prejudice, no filter. He's got the coolest chair here. I want to try it. Sophie let out a nervous laugh, shaking her head. No, Leo, that's not a toy. But even as she scolded gently, her own eyes lingered on the man longer than she intended. She didn't know his story, not yet. But the sight of him stirred something inside her, a recognition she couldn't quite name. And though she turned back to her plate, she knew the moment hadn't ended. Something had just begun. Leo's small hand tugged insistently at Sophie's sleeve, his voice carrying just loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. Mommy, look, that man has the coolest chair ever. Sophie froze. Her cheeks burned as a few guests glanced their way, eyebrows arching at the boy's blunt announcement. In a hall where conversation floated like champagne bubbles, measured, polite, carefully filtered, Leo's words cut through with a child's unfiltered honesty. She reached for his hand, pressing it down gently against the tablecloth. Leo, shh, she whispered urgently, forcing a nervous smile. That's not something you say out loud. But it was too late. At the VIP table, Ethan Blackwood's gaze had shifted. The billionaire who had spent the evening locked behind a fortress of silence now turned his head toward the farthest corner of the hall. His gray-blue eyes landed directly on the boy who had called out to him, and then a woman at his side. Sophie's heart jumped. For the first time, she realized he had heard every word. Ethan should have looked away. That was his instinct. Over the past 2 years, he had perfected the art of ignoring stares, whispers, and the sting of pity disguised as politeness. But this time felt different. The boy's voice hadn't been sharp with mockery or soft with condescension. It had been bright, enthusiastic, almost admiring. Coolest chair ever. It made Ethan's lips twitch against his will, as though an unfamiliar smile had tried to surface. He hadn't smiled at strangers in months. Sophie, however, wanted to melt into the floor. Her pulse hammered as she leaned toward Leo, whispering through clenched teeth, "Sweetheart, that's rude. We don't talk about people's chairs like that." "But Mommy," Leo argued, green eyes wide with sincerity, "I mean it. It's awesome. It's shiny and strong like a race car." Ethan's shoulders, usually heavy with stiffness, eased ever so slightly. He wasn't offended. If anything, the child's words stirred something inside him, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a very long time. His gaze rose from the boy to the woman sitting beside him. Her dress was simple, her makeup light, her brown hair brushing her shoulders in soft waves. She wasn't like the women he'd grown used to seeing at events like this, adorned in diamonds, dripping in expectation. No, this one carried a warmth that the glittering gowns could never imitate. She was laughing quietly under her breath as she tried to hush her son, and Ethan noticed how even in her embarrassment, there was kindness in her eyes. For a fleeting second, those eyes met his. The ballroom seemed to blur around them, the twirl of gowns, the shimmer of chandeliers, the hum of the orchestra. It was as if the noise fell away, leaving only the space between her corner table and his lonely seat in the center of the room. Sophie felt the weight of his gaze and looked down quickly, her fingers tightening around Leo's small hand. What was she doing? Staring at a billionaire as if she understood him. She had no business meeting his eyes. She was a single mom juggling bills and borrowed time. He was Ethan Blackwood, a name stamped across magazines, a man who once rode horses across manicured estates and commanded empires with the lift of a pen. And yet, when she glanced back, he was still looking at her. Not with pity, not with superiority, but with a quiet intensity that made her chest tighten. It was recognition. Ethan's thoughts, tangled and heavy, shifted in that moment. For years, he had believed himself invisible at gatherings like this. People looked at him, yes, but only long enough to turn away, as though his presence was an unwelcome reminder of fragility. But now, across the room, sat a woman who did not look away. For the first time since the accident, the loneliness in his chest loosened. It startled him. The way his heartbeat changed, the way the bitterness he'd carried seemed to crack ever so slightly. He let out a breath, pressing his palm against the wheel rim beneath the table. He didn't know her name. He didn't know why her son's innocent words had struck differently than all the pitying comments of the past. But he knew one thing with sharp, undeniable clarity. Something inside him had stirred. And he wasn't sure he could push it back down again. Ethan's gaze lingered longer than he intended, the faint trace of warmth in his chest both foreign and unsettling. Yet as quickly as it came, another memory rose to smother it. Clara. He could still see her face that day in the hospital, flawless even when streaked with tears. He remembered the way she held his hand as the doctor explained the extent of his injuries. The words had blurred: spinal cord, permanent damage, lifelong chair. But the look in Clara's eyes cut deeper than any diagnosis. It wasn't love, it was fear. "I can't do this, Ethan," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I can't live this kind of life." And then she was gone. Her footsteps echoed in the corridor, the engagement ring still heavy in Ethan's pocket, never slipped onto her finger. That door had closed, and with it, every illusion he'd had about loyalty. Since then, every party, every handshake, every polite nod from old associates reminded him of what he no longer possessed. Strength. Freedom. Someone willing to stay. He shifted in his chair now, jaw tightening. That woman across the room, the one with laughter in her eyes, what made him think she'd be any different? Sophie lowered her gaze, breaking their silent exchange. She knew the rules of rooms like this. People like him didn't notice people like her. And if they did, it was only for a fleeting curiosity. Still, the look in his eyes unsettled her, not because it was pity, but because it wasn't. It felt like he had seen her, really seen her, in a way most people hadn't in years. But Sophie had her own ghosts. She remembered the day she told her parents she was keeping Leo. Their disappointment had been sharp, almost cruel. "You're throwing your future away?" her mother had said, voice heavy with contempt. Her father had paced the room, muttering about shame and wasted potential. Friends drifted off soon after, choosing easier company than a young woman balancing bottles and late-night shifts. She had chosen her son, and though she'd never regret it, the cost was loneliness. Sitting at the last table by the door tonight was nothing new. It was just another reminder of how far she lived from the center of everyone else's world. Across the room, two lives mirrored each other. One abandoned by love, the other abandoned by family. One had wealth but no companion. The other had laughter but little else. Both had learned what it meant to be left standing on the outside. Leo drummed his spoon again, breaking her thoughts. "Mommy," he whispered, leaning close. "Why is that man all alone?" Sophie's lips pressed together. "Maybe people don't know what to say to him." Leo frowned, clearly unsatisfied with the answer. "Then you should be his friend." Sophie nearly choked on her drink. "What? No, sweetheart, I don't even know him." "But Mommy." Leo's green eyes sparkled with certainty. "You don't need to know someone to be kind, and he looks like he really needs a friend." Her heart clenched at the simple truth. Out of the mouths of children came the kind of clarity adults had long forgotten. She glanced toward the center of the ballroom again. Ethan was still watching. Her pulse quickened. She told herself it was nothing, just a coincidence. But deep down, she knew fate had already set something into motion. Ethan shifted his glass, catching himself wondering the same impossible thought. What would it feel like if she actually walked over? For the first time in years, the loneliness didn't feel like a permanent sentence. It felt like it had been noticed. And in the glow of the chandeliers between laughter and violin strings, a spark flickered quietly to life. Sophie sat at the last table, her pulse thrumming in her ears. Leo's words still echoed. You should be his friend. She tried to brush it off, to laugh at his childish boldness, but the thought refused to fade. Her eyes drifted back toward the center of the hall. Ethan Blackwood sat alone, his tuxedo flawless, his posture straight, yet the air around him heavy. The contrast between him and the rest of the ballroom was impossible to ignore. Couples leaned close, glasses clinked, the bride and groom glowed beneath the lights. But at his table there was only silence. "Mommy?" Leo whispered again, tugging at her sleeve. "If nobody talks to him, he's going to be sad forever." Sophie pressed her lips together. The simplest thing sounded profound coming from him. She turned her wine glass in her hand, weighing the absurd idea forming in her mind. What if I did walk over? A voice in her head scolded her. Don't be ridiculous, Sophie. He's a billionaire. You're just trying to stretch rent money until next Friday. Stay in your lane. But another voice, softer yet stronger, whispered back. So what? He's still a man who looks like he's forgotten what it means to smile. She inhaled deeply, placed her glass down, and before her nerves could talk her out of it, Sophie stood. Her chair scraped softly against the floor. Around her, the closest tables felt quiet. Guests turned, curious. A woman in a modest blue dress walking away from the forgotten table by the door was not something anyone expected. Mommy. Leo's voice rose in surprise, but Sophie gave him a quick wink. Stay here, superhero. I'll be right back. Her heels tapped against the wooden floor as she crossed the distance. Each step felt heavier, as though the eyes of the entire room pressed down on her shoulders. She could hear whispers already sharp, slicing through the music. Who is she? What is that girl doing? Does she know who he is? Sophie's cheeks flushed, but she kept walking. Boldness had never been her habit, yet tonight it wrapped around her like a borrowed cloak. She had lived too long on the edges of life to care what these strangers thought. Maybe Leo was right. Maybe someone had to be brave enough to step forward. Ethan noticed her approach before anyone else. His brows furrowed. He'd grown used to people walking toward him for one of two reasons: curiosity or pity. Neither interested him, but this woman, her stride wasn't hesitant, her gaze wasn't darting away. She walked straight to him as if she belonged there, though every whispered remark said otherwise. Sophie stopped at his table, leaning forward slightly so her face was level with his. Her brown eyes sparkled with something between mischief and kindness. She smiled, not the polished kind meant to impress, but the warm, genuine kind that had gotten her through years of hardship. And then, she said the words that silenced the entire ballroom. Would you like to be my date tonight? For a moment, the orchestra itself seemed to falter. The clinking of glasses stopped. Even the bride's laughter faded into a hush. Every eye in the room locked on the woman who dared ask the billionaire in the wheelchair such a question. Ethan blinked, stunned. Surely he had misheard. A date? Here? Now? His instinct braced for pity, for a condescending tone masked as generosity. But when he looked into her eyes, there was none. No pity, no charity, only a playful challenge. You're joking, he muttered, his voice low, almost rough. Maybe, Sophie replied lightly, tilting her head. But if you say no, You'll ruin the best entrance I've ever made." A ripple of shock spread through the guests. Some gasped, others smirked. A few raised their phones to capture the scene unfolding before them. Ethan's chest tightened. He had spent years shielded behind silence, convinced no one could see him as more than the chair he sat in. And yet, here was this stranger, unafraid of the crowd, asking him to step back into life as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He gripped the edge of the table, feeling the burn of every gaze fixed on him. He wanted to retreat, to wave her off with a dismissive shake of the head. But against his will, a sound rose from deep in his chest, a laugh. Rough, awkward, but real. His first in months, and the ballroom, stunned into silence, now leaned closer, waiting to see what he would do next. The silence that followed Ethan's laugh hung heavy, as though the entire ballroom didn't know whether to breathe or gasp. Sophie's smile deepened at the sound. It wasn't polished or practiced, but raw, unguarded. And in that laugh, she saw what Leo had seen all along. A man who needed a friend, not an audience. She straightened, placing her hand gently on the armrest of his chair. "Shall we?" she asked softly, her voice carrying further than she expected in the hush. Ethan arched a brow, torn between disbelief and intrigue. "You're serious." "Of course I'm serious," Sophie replied, her tone as light as if she were inviting him to a casual stroll. "Every great party deserves a proper entrance, don't you think?" The whispers began immediately, rippling through the hall. "What is she doing? She can't possibly. Oh my God, she's wheeling him out there." Sophie ignored them all. She wrapped her fingers around the polished handles of his chair and, with a steady push, guided Ethan away from the lonely corner of the VIP table and toward the glowing center of the dance floor. Gasps followed. Heads turned. Some guests pulled out their phones to record the spectacle. But Sophie kept her eyes forward, her stride sure, her chin lifted, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. Ethan sat rigid at first, his jaw tense, his hands gripping the rims of his chair. He hated being stared at like a novelty. But Sophie's warmth at his back, her confidence in every push, softened the weight of all those eyes. When they reached the middle of the dance floor, the orchestra faltered for a beat before resuming its waltz. Couples parted slightly, giving them space. A circle formed, filled with doubt, curiosity, and the faintest trace of mockery. Sophie leaned closer, her lips near his ear. "Ready to dance, Mr. Blackwood?" Ethan let out a dry laugh. "Dance? In this?" He gestured toward the chair. Sophie grinned, spinning him gently so the wheels turned in a smooth circle. His surprise widened as she twirled him like a partner might spin on her toes. The crowd gasped again, louder this time. "Not dance," Sophie whispered, her eyes sparkling. "Glide." She pushed him forward, then pulled back, spinning him in rhythm to the music. Her dress flared as she moved around him, her laughter bright as if the whispers didn't exist. To the onlookers, it seemed absurd at first, but then something changed. Ethan felt it first, the sensation of being part of the music instead of an observer on the sidelines. For months he had watched life move while he remained still. But here, under Sophie's hands, the rhythm carried him, not as a burden, but as a partner. The crowd's murmurs shifted, gasps gave way to applause. The circle of onlookers leaned in, astonished. A woman had dared to make the billionaire in the wheelchair, not an exhibit, but the star of the floor. And then, just as the tension began to ease, a small voice cut through the music. "Mommy, I want to dance too." Leo darted from the last table, his napkin still tied around his neck like a cape. He squeezed between the couples and sprinted into the circle, his shoes squeaking against the polished wood. He ran straight to Ethan, planting himself behind the chair with a triumphant grin. "Hey, mister, I'll be your engine. Vroom, vroom." The ballroom erupted in laughter. Children at the edge of the crowd clapped, and even the stiffest guests smiled despite themselves. Ethan froze for a second, then burst into a laugh so deep and full it startled even him. The sound echoed against the chandeliers, carried by the orchestra's rising notes. His chest shook, his shoulders eased, and for the first time since the accident, the laughter felt alive. Sophie pretended to sigh dramatically. "Two partners? I'm outnumbered now." Leo giggled, pushing the chair with small bursts of effort. "Don't worry, Mommy. We're a team." Sophie bent, placing her hand back on the handle beside Leo's. "Then let's show them how a team dances." Together they spun Ethan in circles, forward and back, weaving into the rhythm of the waltz. The crowd clapped in time, applause building, until it drowned out the whispers of pity. No one looked at Ethan with sadness anymore. They looked with wonder. And in that dazzling circle of light, with Sophie's laughter on one side and Leo's playful shouts on the other, Ethan's heart felt something he had nearly forgotten existed. Joy. The kind that couldn't be bought with all the billions in the world. The applause still echoed as the waltz faded, but Sophie leaned down, her voice low enough for only Ethan to hear. "Too many eyes in there. Want to catch some air?" Ethan glanced around the ballroom. Guests were still watching, phones still raised. He'd endured being a spectacle for 2 years, but tonight felt different. The weight of the stairs no longer smothered him. Still, the thought of escaping to somewhere quieter sounded like relief. He gave a short nod. "Lead the way." Sophie guided his chair toward a side door draped with ivory curtains. Leo skipped beside them, his cape fluttering with each step. As they slipped through, the noise of the ballroom softened, replaced by the gentle hush of the night. Outside stretched a small garden strung with golden fairy lights. They dangled from tree branches and arched along the stone pathway, glowing like suspended stars. The air was cooler here, carrying the faint scent of roses planted along the edges. Away from the chandeliers and polished marble, it felt softer, almost sacred. Sophie parked Ethan's chair near a wooden bench and sat down beside him. Leo darted toward the grass, chasing fireflies with outstretched hands. His laughter floated in the air, unbothered by the weight of adult worries. For a while, neither Sophie nor Ethan spoke. The silence wasn't awkward, it was a reprieve. Ethan tilted his head back, staring at the lights swaying gently above. He hadn't realized how long it had been since he'd looked at something so simple. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice quieter than the wind. Sophie turned to him. "For what? For dragging me out there. For making me laugh when I thought I couldn't anymore." He exhaled sharply. "It's been a long time since I felt like part of something." Sophie smiled, though her eyes softened. "You didn't need me for that. You just needed a reason to remember you're still alive." Her words struck him deeper than she knew. Ethan swallowed, shifting slightly in his chair. He hadn't intended to share more, but the quiet garden and her steady presence made the words spill out. After the accident, everything became smaller. Rehab centers, sterile rooms, the smell of antiseptic. People came at first, friends, business partners. Texts like, "You okay, man? Need anything?" Then the messages stopped. Calls went unanswered. I was no longer the man they wanted to be around. His jaw clenched. Even Clara, we were supposed to get married. The day she walked out of that hospital room, I realized I wasn't a fiancé anymore. I was a burden. The fairy lights shimmered against the sharp lines of his face, revealing not just power but wariness. He let out a hollow laugh. "Funny, isn't it? I could sign deals worth billions, but I had to learn how to slide from this chair into a bed without falling. I used to close markets with my name, and now I had to relearn how to hold a spoon without spilling." Sophie's throat tightened, but she didn't interrupt. She didn't tell him he was strong. She didn't coat his pain with pity. She simply listened, her expression steady, her presence quiet but unyielding. Ethan turned his head, studying her. "You're not saying anything." "Because you don't need me to say something," Sophie replied gently. "You just need me to hear you." For a moment his chest loosened. No pity, no forced encouragement, just honesty. He hadn't realized how starved he was for it until now. Leo's laughter rang again as he held up his hands, pretending to trap a firefly. Sophie glanced at her son, then back at Ethan. "Life strips us down, doesn't it? Makes us smaller than we thought we'd ever be, but maybe that's when we figure out what actually matters." Ethan's eyes lingered on her face, the glow of the lights reflecting in her brown eyes. For the first time in years, he felt as though someone wasn't looking at the wheelchair at all. She was looking at him, and that realization stirred something he thought had been buried forever. The fairy lights swayed in the night breeze, golden threads shimmering above them. For a moment, Ethan thought the garden might swallow his words, carrying them into the quiet of the city beyond. But Sophie remained still beside him, her shoulders angled toward his, her presence solid and unflinching. "You said everyone left after the accident," she murmured. "That must have been heavy." Ethan let out a dry laugh. "That's one way to put it." Her eyes lingered on him, soft but steady. Then she turned her gaze toward the path where Leo chased fireflies, his cape fluttering behind him. A silence stretched, filled only by the sound of the boy's laughter. Sophie clasped her hands in her lap, fingers twisting gently, as though deciding whether to keep something hidden or let it spill into the night. Finally, she spoke. People left me too, but for a different reason. Ethan glanced at her, curiosity flickering in his tired eyes. When I told my parents I was keeping Leo, they didn't congratulate me. They didn't smile or offer to help. They looked at me like I had just ended my future. Her voice trembled slightly, though she quickly steadied it. My mother said I was ruining everything. My father couldn't even look at me. They stopped visiting soon after. Friends faded too. It was easier for them to pretend I didn't exist than to stand beside the single mom who'd made a choice they couldn't understand. She paused, drawing a deep breath. But you know what? I've never regretted it. Not once. Every time Leo laughs like that. She nodded toward the boy now twirling in the grass. I know I chose right. My life isn't perfect. Most days, it's a mess of bills and double shifts and shoes with holes in them. But when I look at him, I see every reason I need to keep going. Ethan studied her profile. The garden light caught the curve of her cheek, the determined lift of her chin. He saw no shame in her eyes, only resilience, carved from years of learning to stand alone. Do people mock you? He asked quietly. All the time, Sophie admitted, a faint smile tugging at her lips. At the cafe, some women whisper when they see me take Leo to school in the same coat I wore last winter. Parents at birthday parties don't say it out loud, but I see the way they look at me, like I made a mistake they'd never forgive. Even some of Emily's friends tonight, they smiled politely, but I know what they're thinking. That I don't belong here. That my invitation was charity. Her shoulders lifted slightly, as though shaking off invisible dust. But belonging isn't what matters to me anymore. Raising Leo, giving him love, making sure he never feels like he isn't enough, that's what matters. That's my wealth. Ethan's breath caught. The simplicity of her words carried a power he hadn't expected. He, who had measured life in numbers and empires, felt humbled by the woman who measured hers in laughter and scraped together rent. You're stronger than you realize, he said, his voice low but firm. Sophie gave a soft laugh. Or maybe I'm just stubborn. Either way, I refuse to let anyone define me by what I don't have. I may not own diamonds or penthouses, but I have a boy who looks at me like I hung the moon, and that's enough. The quiet sincerity of her statement settled between them like a fragile truth. Ethan turned his head, their eyes locking under the glow of the lights. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like the one being pitied. He felt something else, something he hadn't let himself imagine since Clara walked out of his life. Admiration. Sophie had bared her scars without shame, and in doing so, she had given him permission to believe his own didn't make him less of a man. A bond, subtle but undeniable, formed in that quiet garden. Not built on pity or pretense, but on shared loneliness, met with courage. For the first time since the accident, Ethan felt the walls around his heart begin to shift. The hush of the garden clung to Ethan as Sophie pushed his chair back toward the doors. Leo trotted at her side, cupcake in hand, his cape slipping from his shoulders. When they stepped into the ballroom, the shift was immediate. Conversations faltered, eyes turned, even the orchestra softened its song. This was not the Ethan Blackwood who had sat silent at the VIP table earlier. His shoulders were looser now, his face alive with a smile that seemed almost foreign, and most striking of all, his laughter, deep and unrestrained as Leo whispered something only he could hear. Gasps stirred among the guests. Associates exchanged glances, their voices low. Is that really him? He looks alive again. I haven't seen him smile since the accident. For years, Ethan had been the symbol of a tragedy, proof that wealth could not shield against loss. But tonight, he was something else. A man smiling freely in the company of a boy with frosting on his chin, and a woman who walked with quiet defiance. Sophie felt the eyes on her but didn't falter. She guided Ethan's chair steadily, her chin lifted. Beside her, Leo waved his cupcake like a flag of triumph, oblivious to the hierarchy of gowns and diamonds. The trio paused at the edge of the floor. Couples gave way, unsure of what to do, yet the mood had already shifted. The pity that once clung to Ethan dissolved, replaced by curiosity, even admiration. For Ethan, it was as if the glass wall between him and the world had cracked. The whispers didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the boy's grin and the steady courage of the woman who dared to reach for him when no one else had. Love, true and unexpected, unsettled people, precisely because it couldn't be bought or bargained. It revealed what status and wealth could never touch. Sophie bent down slightly, her voice soft. "You're holding up well," Ethan chuckled. "I'm more than holding up. I feel human again." And as she guided him further beneath the chandeliers, Ethan knew with certainty this night had already changed everything. The music still played, but for Ethan the night already felt different. The garden had steadied him, and now, back beneath the chandeliers, there was an ease he hadn't known in years. Sophie guided his chair toward the edge of the floor, where Leo slumped in his seat, grinning through cupcake crumbs. Ethan chuckled at the boy's stubborn cheer, then turned to Sophie. "You're unusual," he said quietly. Her brows rose. "That a compliment?" "Absolutely. Most people want something. Deals, favors, introductions. You gave me something no one has in years." "And what's that?" He met her eyes, a real laugh. Her lips curved faintly and she pulled a pen from her purse. On a napkin's corner she scribbled a number and slipped it into his hand. "In case you forget how." Ethan stared at the napkin as if it were priceless. No tactics, no pretense, just honesty. "I'll keep this," he murmured. "Your choice," Sophie said with a teasing glint. "But don't expect daily motivational quotes." The laugh that followed surprised him with its ease. The hall was emptying when Ethan's chauffeur appeared. "Sir, the car is ready whenever you wish." Ethan glanced at Sophie. "Let me give you and Leo a ride home. It's late." Her smile softened, but she shook her head. "That's kind, but we'll be fine. We'll take a taxi." "It's no trouble," he pressed. "I know," she answered firmly, "but I've always managed on my own. I'd rather keep it that way." Ethan paused, then smiled, genuine, unguarded. "You're the first person in years to tell me no, and mean it." "Get used to it," Sophie replied with a light laugh. He studied her, really studied her. The woman who had crossed a ballroom to offer him dignity instead of pity. The one who refused to let his wealth dictate the terms of her life. For the first time in years, Ethan didn't feel like a billionaire above the crowd. He felt like a man, seen for who he was. As Sophie gathered Leo's jacket, Ethan clenched the napkin in his hand. This wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of something he hadn't thought possible. And when she offered one last smile before stepping away, he thought, no empire he had ever built was worth as much as this moment. The night drew to a close, but the story it birthed lingered longer than the music. In a hall glittering with silk gowns and polished diamonds, where status shimmered like glass, something entirely different stole the spotlight. It wasn't the grandeur of the chandelier or the expense of the wine that people remembered. It was the laugh of a child who saw no disability, only a cool chair. It was the boldness of a single mother who refused to let the whispers of strangers dictate her steps. And it was a man rediscovering the truth that had slipped from his grasp, that even broken wings can still catch the wind when courage dares to guide them. Ethan Blackwood had been many things: heir, CEO, billionaire, headline. But none of those titles mattered in the moment. Sophie placed her hand on the back of his chair and said, "Would you like to be my date tonight?" With that one audacious question, she gave him something no empire could buy: human connection. And Sophie, who had spent years being dismissed as too young, too reckless, too ruined by her choice to raise Leo alone, found her strength mirrored in the eyes of a man the world assumed had lost his. Two lives, both marked by abandonment, met in the center of a crowded room and reminded everyone watching that wealth cannot purchase joy, nor can pity replace dignity. In that ballroom, where power was measured in fortunes, the true riches revealed themselves quietly. A boy's laughter ringing like music, a mother's courage cutting through doubt, and a man daring to laugh again after years of silence. The guests who whispered, who recorded, who wondered what they were witnessing, they saw something uncomfortable. Because love in its truest form is not staged or bought. It rises where no one expects it. It moves where status cannot follow. And so the story closed not with contracts signed or champagne poured, but with a truth that outshone every jewel in the room. Sometimes love doesn't walk in. Sometimes it rolls across the dance floor. If you were sitting in that ballroom, would you have walked across the floor like Sophie did, or stayed in your seat? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and tell us what country you're watching from. We love seeing our family from all around the world. And if this story touched you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you never miss the next journey of courage, love, and second chances.